The Council's last hope. The war room aboard the Council station hung in silence. It was the kind of silence that followed funerals, the kind that spoke of exhaustion deeper than bone. Around the circular table sat representatives from 17 species, each one a monument to evolutionary triumph. The Valorians, with their six-segmented limbs and crystalline exoskeletons that could deflect plasma fire. The Sethkal, whose neural processing allowed them to calculate battle outcomes in microseconds. The ancient Prin, who had mastered gravity manipulation before humanity's ancestors learned to walk upright. All of them were losing. High Chancellor Vector of the Valorian Protectorate stood at the center of the chamber, his carapace dulled by stress. Behind him, the tactical display showed the galaxy bleeding red. 314 systems consumed. 47 billion souls devoured. The Krath Overmind didn't negotiate. It didn't pause. It simply expanded, converting biomass into more of itself, growing stronger with every world it touched. "We have 8 months," Vector said. His voice resonated through the translation matrix with a quality that suggested he'd repeated these words too many times. "Our projections are unanimous. In 8 months, the Overmind will achieve critical mass. It will be unstoppable. We will be extinct." No one spoke. They'd heard variations of this speech for 2 centuries. At first there had been outrage, then determination, then strategies and counter-strategies. Now there was only the mathematics of extinction. "There is one option remaining," Vector continued, and something in his tone made the room stir. "The survey teams have located a previously uncontacted species in the Orion Arm. Designation: human. They achieved faster than light travel 43 standard years ago. They have no fleet worth mentioning. No territory beyond their home system. By every metric, they are irrelevant." Ambassador Thelsina of the Sethkal interrupted with a sharp clicking sound. "Then why are we discussing them?" Vector manipulated the display. A blue-green planet appeared, rotating slowly. Earth. The data streams began flowing, and several council members leaned forward despite themselves. The atmospheric composition was violent. The tectonic activity was extreme. The biodiversity was chaotic, with millions of species competing in an endless arms race of adaptation. It was, by any civilized standard, a death world. "They evolved here," Vector said quietly. "In 200,000 years, they went from stone tools to quantum processors. They survived 6 mass extinctions. They domesticated fire, animals, crops, and eventually atoms. They fought 10,000 wars against themselves and never stopped building. They've sent probes beyond their star while still arguing about borders on their homeworld. They are paradoxes wrapped in fragility." The Prin delegate, whose species had achieved spaceflight when Earth was still covered in ice, made a dismissive gesture. "Desperation is making you sentimental, Chancellor. What can primitives offer that our combined might cannot achieve?" "I don't know," Vector admitted. "But I know that we've tried everything our brilliant minds could devise. We've lost fleets with commanders who spent centuries studying warfare. We've thrown resources at this enemy that would terraform 100 worlds. And we're still dying." He paused, letting the weight settle. "The humans come from a place where death is the only constant, where survival is earned every single day. Maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need someone who doesn't know when to give up." The debate that followed was brief, not because anyone believed it would work, but because they had nothing left to lose. The vote was unanimous. They would contact humanity. They would beg for help from a species that barely qualified as spacefaring. It was, several delegates thought privately, a dignified way to go extinct. The message was sent 3 days later. It reached Earth's primitive communication network and was routed through channels that took it from military command to scientific oversight to political leadership. The response came faster than anyone expected. Admiral Elena Carter was chosen to lead humanity's first expeditionary force. She was 53 years old, with gray streaking her black hair, and a service record that included peacekeeping missions on Mars and counter-piracy operations in the asteroid belt. She'd never fought in a real war. No living human had. The last great conflict had ended 70 years ago, and humanity had spent the time since building outward, arguing inward, and dreaming upward. When she stood before the United Earth Council to receive her orders, someone asked her if she understood what she was walking into. The galaxy's finest had been fighting for 2 centuries and failing. What made her think 12 human ships could make a difference? Carter had smiled, and there was something in that expression that would later become famous across 1,000 worlds. It wasn't arrogance or ignorance. It was the particular brand of defiance that only came from a species that had clawed its way to the top of a planet that kept trying to kill it. Because, she'd said, we've never been very good at accepting the impossible. 6 weeks later, her fleet jumped into Council space. 12 ships, 4,000 crew members, weapons that seemed primitive compared to the Council's arsenal. The galaxy's last hope arrived in the form of beings who didn't know they were supposed to be useless. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, the Krath Overmind detected the new signatures and filed them under the category of irrelevant biomass. It was the first miscalculation the Overmind had made in 200 years. Fire in the void. The briefing aboard the Terran flagship Indomitable lasted 3 hours. Admiral Carter sat at the head of the tactical table, surrounded by her command staff and 3 Council liaisons, who looked like they'd stepped out of a fever dream. The Valorian military attaché, Commander Genyak, kept his secondary arms folded in what Carter had learned was a sign of skepticism. The Sethkal tactical officer spoke in rapid bursts of sound that the translation AI rendered with clinical precision. The Prin observer simply floated, saying nothing, judging everything. The situation was worse than Earth's intelligence had suggested. The Krath Overmind wasn't just winning, it was accelerating. Every fleet engagement fed it new biological data. Every captured world gave it more resources. The Council's strategy had devolved into delaying actions and evacuations. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to die slowly. Your assignment, Janak explained, his translated voice carrying an edge of apology, is to reinforce the defense of Theta 9. It's a mining colony in the outer territories. Strategic value is minimal, but the civilian population is still evacuating. We need 3 days, maybe 4. Carter studied the tactical display. Theta 9 sat at the edge of a nebula, isolated and exposed. The Krath fleet heading toward it numbered 67 vessels, each one a nightmare of biological engineering. Ships grown rather than built, powered by organic fusion and armed with weapons that dissolved molecular bonds. Behind them came the harvest drones ready to process every living thing on the planet below. You want us to hold for 4 days against 67 enemy ships? Carter said. It wasn't a question. We don't expect you to hold, Janak admitted quietly. We expect you to delay them long enough for the transports to escape. Then you retreat. No one will think less of you. He searched for the words. This is what the war has become. Carter looked around the table at her officers. Commander Jackson, her tactical officer, who'd cut his teeth hunting pirates in the belt. Captain Okonkwo, who commanded the carrier Defiant and had a reputation for creative solutions. Lieutenant Reeves, the youngest person at the table, fresh from the academy and trying not to look terrified. How many civilians? Carter asked. Approximately 120,000, the Sethkal officer responded. Mostly Valorian, some mixed settlements. The transports can carry 87,000 in the time available. So 30,000 die, Jackson said flatly. Yes. Carter leaned back. She'd read the history files during the journey to Council space. 2 centuries of fighting, billions dead. Entire species reduced to refugee populations. The mathematics of triage had become second nature to these people. They calculated acceptable losses the way humans calculated fuel consumption. No, Carter said. Jennick's translator took a moment to process that. Admiral, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly, Carter interrupted. You're asking us to participate in managed extinction. To calculate which civilians get to live based on cargo capacity and timetables. She stood, placing her hands on the table. That's not how humans fight. Then how do you fight? The Prin observer asked, speaking for the first time. Its voice was like wind through crystals. Carter smiled that smile again. Badly, desperately, with everything we have and a few things we'll make up along the way. She turned to Jackson. Get me a channel to all ships, and someone find me every engineer who's ever jury-rigged something they weren't supposed to. The plan that emerged over the next 6 hours violated several dozen council regulations and at least 3 laws of physics as the Valorians understood them. The human fleet would jump directly into the Theta 9 system ahead of the Krath, giving them time to set up. But instead of forming a defensive perimeter, they'd split into 3 groups. The carriers would drop every small craft they had and rig them as automated drones using mining equipment stripped from the colony below. The cruisers would move into the nebula itself, using the radiation and debris to mask their signatures. The destroyers would do something the council officers insisted was suicidal. They would charge. When the Krath fleet emerged from FTL, they found chaos waiting. Hundreds of small craft, most unmanned, swarming in attack patterns that made no tactical sense. Human fighters wove between Krath vessels, too fast and erratic for the biological targeting systems to track efficiently. And then the cruisers opened fire from inside the nebula, their missiles appearing out of the cosmic haze like angry hornets. The Krath overmind processed the data and adjusted. It recognized the improvisation, the disorder, the lack of formal doctrine. It calculated optimal responses and deployed them. What it didn't calculate was human stubbornness. When the destroyer Zealous took critical damage, its captain didn't retreat. He rammed the ship into a Krath harvester, buying the evacuation transports another 10 minutes. When the carrier Defiant lost main power, Captain Okonkwo had his crew use maneuvering thrusters to position the ship as a physical shield between the enemy and the colony. When Lieutenant Reeves's fighter lost weapons, she used the craft itself as a kinetic projectile, ejecting at the last second and trusting her wingman to pick her up. The battle lasted 19 hours. By the time it ended, 4 human ships were destroyed or crippled beyond repair. Another 3 were held together by emergency patches and prayers. Casualty reports came in with numbers that made Carter's chest tight. 800 dead, 1,500 wounded, but the transports escaped. All of them. 120,000 civilians made it out. Not 87,000. Not an acceptable loss. All of them. When the human fleet limped back to council space, they found something waiting they hadn't expected. The comm channels lit up with messages from a dozen species. The tactical feeds had been broadcast across the defensive networks. Everyone had watched 12 primitive ships hold against 67 Krath vessels. Everyone had seen humans fight like creatures who'd never learned the mathematics of surrender. Admiral Carter sat in her ready room, staring at casualty reports and trying to figure out how to write 800 letters to families back home. Her door chimed. Janox stood in the corridor, his carapace somehow seeming brighter than before. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "We called you primitives. We thought you were irrelevant. And now?" Carter asked. "Now we're wondering if we forgot what it means to fight for something instead of against something." He hesitated, then performed what the translation matrix called a gesture of deep respect. "The Council is calling it the miracle of Theta 9. They want to know what orders you gave that made it possible." Carter thought about Okonkwo using his carrier as a shield, about Reeves ejecting from her fighter, about 800 people who died doing impossible things because someone needed them to. "I didn't order a miracle," she said quietly. "I just reminded them what humans do when someone tells us a thing can't be done." The turning tide. The war changed after Theta 9, but not in ways the Council expected. They'd wanted humanity to be shock troops, expendable courage to buy time for smarter strategies. What they got instead was a virus that spread through every fleet, every command center, every defeated species clinging to hope. The humans didn't fight like the Council fought. They didn't calculate acceptable losses or retreat according to doctrine. They told jokes over combat channels while dodging plasma fire. They sang songs that their translation AIs struggled to render. They gave their ships names like Defiant and Unbroken and Try Stopping Us, which made the Valorian admirals shake their heads in confusion. More importantly, they shared everything. Human tactical officers embedded themselves in council fleets and taught improvisation seminars. Human engineers showed maintenance crews how to bypass safety regulations when survival mattered, more than protocol. Human Marines trained alongside Valorian shock troops and Sethkal infiltrators, teaching them something the galaxy had forgotten, that fear was a tool, not a defeat condition. Admiral Carter became something unexpected, not a military commander but a symbol. Other species watched her stand on bridge decks during battles, calm while hell raged outside. They listened to her briefings where she talked about objectives in terms of people saved, rather than territory held. They saw her weep at memorial services for crew members whose names she'd memorized, and somehow that made her seem stronger, rather than weaker. The Krath Overmind noticed the shift. Its distributed intelligence processed combat data across 73 active fronts and detected the anomaly. Engagement losses were increasing. Tactical predictions were failing more frequently. The pattern centered on locations where human forces operated, But the humans themselves weren't the variable. They were the catalyst. 6 months after Theta 9, the Overmind did something it had never done before. It adapted its strategy specifically to counter a single species. It began targeting human vessels with disproportionate force. It allocated resources to studying human psychology. It created new drone variants designed to exploit human physical weaknesses. The Council watched this development with horror. The Overmind was learning, which meant humanity had made themselves its priority target. Several delegations approached Carter with the same suggestion: pull back. Let the humans survive by becoming less visible. The war would continue, but humanity wouldn't be marked for extinction. Carter's response became famous. She broadcast it on open channels so everyone could hear, human and alien alike. The Overmind is afraid of us, she said, not because we're stronger or smarter or better armed. It's afraid because we showed the galaxy that giving up isn't inevitable, that 12 ships can hold where 1,000 retreated, that fragile beings from a death world can laugh at extinction and make it blink first. She paused, and her voice carried across light years with absolute certainty. So no, we're not pulling back. We're going to teach this thing what humanity learned a long time ago. The most dangerous creature in any fight isn't the biggest or the fastest. It's the one too stubborn to know when it's beaten. The Overmind's response was immediate. It launched a massive assault on the human defensive line at the Kepler cluster, throwing everything it had at the position. 3,000 Krath vessels against a combined fleet of 800, of which only 40 were human ships. The Battle of Kepler lasted 3 days. It was brutal, chaotic, and by every tactical analysis impossible to win. But halfway through the second day, something shifted. A Valorian battle group that had been preparing to retreat instead turned and charged back into the fight. Their commander broadcasting a human song about standing ground. A Sethkal science vessel, unarmed and meant for observation, reconfigured its sensor array into a makeshift weapon and took out 2 Krath destroyers. Prin support craft started using gravity manipulation, not for defense but for aggressive maneuvers that made human pilots laugh with delight. The galaxy was remembering how to fight. When the Overmind finally withdrew, it left behind fields of wreckage and casualty counts that would take weeks to process, but it had withdrawn. For the first time in 200 years, the Krath Overmind had committed to a battle and then retreated before achieving its objective. The Council met in emergency session. The humans had lost 14 ships at Kepler. Casualty rates among human forces were 3 times higher than any other species. But the overall fleet had held and, more importantly, had fought with coordination and courage that hadn't existed 6 months ago. High Chancellor Vector stood before the assembly with his carapace gleaming, restored to its full luster. We asked humanity to buy us time, he said. Instead, they bought us something more valuable. They reminded us what we used to be before 2 centuries of losing, taught us to calculate our own extinction. The human delegation sat quietly in their observers section. Carter was there, promoted to fleet admiral and given command authority that spanned multiple sectors. She watched the council debate resource allocation and strategic priorities with an energy that had been absent before. They were arguing about how to win now, not how to die with dignity. After the session, the Prin Elder approached her. The ancient being floated silently for a moment before speaking. We had a saying, it translated. Before the war, before we learned to count the dead and measure hope in months, we said, the stars belong to those who reach. We'd forgotten what that meant. And now? Carter asked. Now we understand that reaching for the stars means nothing if you don't have the courage to grasp them when the void tries to pull you back. The Prin performed, a gesture that the translation matrix struggled to render. It meant something like respect but also gratitude, and a third emotion that humans didn't have a word for, recognition perhaps, of seeing yourself reflected in another. Carter returned to the Indomitable that evening and found a message waiting. It was from Earth, from the council chambers where she'd received her orders nearly a year ago. They wanted to know when she was coming home. The first wave had been supposed to last 6 months. It had been 9 and the war wasn't over. She recorded her response while looking out at the stars through the viewport. Somewhere in that darkness, the Overmind was recalculating, adapting, preparing its next move. And somewhere else, on thousands of worlds, people from dozens of species were looking at those same stars and remembering that they'd survived this long for a reason. We'll come home when the job's done, Carter said to the recording. That's what humans do. We show up when someone needs help. We stand ground when others can't. We hold the line until everyone gets out alive, and we don't count the cost until after everyone's safe. She smiled, tired but unbroken. Tell them we're fine. Tell them the galaxy trembled when we got here, and we're going to make damn sure it knows we're staying until it stops trembling in fear and starts trembling with hope instead. The message was transmitted across the quantum link to Earth, where it would arrive 3 days later and spark celebrations in 100 cities. But it was also intercepted by Council monitoring stations, translated into 47 languages, and spread across every human-allied world. The war would continue for another 2 years. There would be more battles, more losses, more moments where extinction seemed inevitable, but the tide had turned at Theta 9 held at Kepler, and would eventually break entirely at the final confrontation near the galactic core, where humanity would teach the Overmind the most important lesson their death world had taught them. That life, when pushed to the edge, doesn't calculate surrender. It fights. And sometimes, against all logic and probability, it wins. The galaxy had trembled when humanity joined the fight. But in the end, it was the Krath Overmind that learned what every predator on Earth had discovered over millions of years. That the most dangerous prey is the one that's already survived 1,000 extinctions and evolved to meet every threat with the same defiant response. Try me.